ta'asu avel b'mishpat. You shall not render an unjust decision. These are the words of our parasha, words that Clara mentioned earlier from the Holiness Code, the heart of Leviticus, the spine of Torah. There's so much in this Torah portion, so many mitzvot, so many sacred obligations that speak to the very core of what it is to be human, what it is to be a Jew. But this week, to me, this verse stands out above all others. Lo ta'asu avel b'mishpat. You shall not render an unjust decision. Rashi, the 11th century French commentator, explains, this teaches us that the judge who perverts judgment is called an unjust person, hateful and detested, doomed to destruction and an abomination. As he often does, Rashi draws from the Midrashic tradition, which reads, Melamed shehadayan hamekalel et hadin nikra avel. This teaches that the judge who curses justice is called an unjust person. He goes on, Vigorem, and this person, this judge, causes 5 things to occur. Letamea ta'aretz, polluting the land. Umesalek et hashchina, causing the divine presence to be cast away. Mechalel et Hashem, profaning God's name. Umapil et Yisrael becherev, casting the sword against Israel. Megillah otam me'artzam, and expelling them from their land. I've spoken about abortion rights before. I've shared what I believe to be the normative Jewish position on the matter back in October of 2020 when Abby Wolof and I met and sang week after week in this empty, capacious sanctuary, and I beamed into your living rooms or kitchens or wherever your screens might have been at the time. I spoke at the behest of the National Council of Jewish Women as part of their Rabbis for Repro initiative. I'm bemoaned the timing so soon after Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death of her looming replacement and what that could surely mean for reproductive rights. I said back then, normative evangelical Christian perspectives on these issues are not de facto religious perspectives. They do not represent us, our contemporary values, nor our traditional and historic beliefs. In fighting for freedom of choice to worship as we see fit and for the sanctity of women's bodies, Jews reflect the story of our millennia-old tradition, which, despite its baked-in patriarchy, does not consider the prevention of pregnancy to be a crime, nor the termination of pregnancy to be murder. I laid out the particular verses and rabbinic commentaries that clarify the status of the fetus. I won't repeat them here, but suffice it to say, life for us does not begin at conception. I said the story of reproductive rights in America is not just a story of privacy and the sovereignty of women's bodies, it's also the story of how no religious perspective should determine public policy. Those who are not religious must speak up to insist on their right to their secular beliefs and practices. But those of us who are religious must also speak up for those who are religious, and so that no religion be treated as dominant, as supreme. To be Jewish in America is to insist on these freedoms for all. Human life matters, it's paramount. Fetuses are not without some status in Jewish tradition, and abortion should not be taken lightly. But I dare you to find any measurable number of women who have had abortions who take those decisions lightly. The question isn't whether it's a hard choice to make. The question is only who gets to make that choice. To have a child or not to have a child, it's not men, it's not the state, it's women themselves. Suffice it to say, our worst fears appear to be coming true. Lo ta'asu avel b'mishpat, you shall not render an unjust decision. The Oxford Jewish Study Bible suggests the verse can be rendered, you shall not create distortion in judgment. They point the reader to verse 35, which you may have noticed uses exactly the same phrase, lo ta'su avel b'mishpat, but then adds the following context, b'midah, b'mishkal, u'v'misorah. You shall not falsify measures of length, weight, or capacity. Bible scholar Richard Elliott Friedman asks, these exact words are already said in 1915. Why are they repeated here? Because the law here is adding weights and measures to the picture. This conveys that an abuse in doing business is in the same category as an abuse in court. The issues are equity, fairness, and honesty. The point here is that meting out justice must itself be just. Just as the earlier context is not about favoring, or is about not favoring the wealthy or the poor, here Torah demands a system of equal weights and measures. At the risk of borrowing too heavily from Clara's favorite new show, Moon Knight, a conceit of that show is that each person must strive for balanced scales within society and within themselves. Perhaps the most tragic situation is when a society uses the language of fairness and equity to undermine the application of those very principles. This week, we saw a judge, a justice of the U.S. Supreme Court no less, begin to dismantle nearly 50 years of legal precedent. And worse, he and those who presumably have signed on to this approach have done so by claiming not that they're ignoring precedent, but restoring it. Here's how the twisted logic goes. Justice Alito says that for an unenumerated right, that's a right that's not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution to be legitimate, like the right of women to access safe and legal abortions, it must have been understood to exist when the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. Since back then, many states had criminalized abortion and there was no understanding that women had a right to end their pregnancies. The notion that women have a right to make individual decisions about their bodies is not sustained by the Constitution, according to this line of reasoning. For what it's worth, even though the Alito opinion rules out, in its own words, other so-called privacy rights, many legal scholars suspect that if this opinion stands, it could open the floodgates, challenging everything from access to contraception to marriage equality. Friends, we could discuss the ways the anti-abortion movement has veered suddenly and strikingly to the right in the last few years. But the more important point today, I think, is that we Jews should be suspicious when anyone plays this kind of game with history. Alito's circular logic that you can't say the Constitution means anything it couldn't have envisioned when it was written is at the very heart of what it means to be, quote, a judge who curses justice. Why? Because the subtext of this worldview is a desire to return to a time when, put plainly, men had more control over women. Before women were admitted to many schools and universities, men controlled women's access to knowledge. Before the 19th Amendment, men controlled women's capacity to exercise political power. Before the invention of the birth control pill, men held sole possession of the ability to prevent pregnancy. And before Roe versus Wade, in the majority of states around the country, men and the women who agreed with them forced women to continue unwanted pregnancies. Add to this that 11 states, including Mississippi, have so-called no exception laws that criminalize abortion in cases of rape and incest. The Supreme Court is now poised to punish victims of sexual violence by removing their choice of whether or not to carry that pregnancy and bear a child who is the result of a crime. What is the definition of a judge who curses justice? It's someone who manipulates memory to enshrine regressive policies in the name of history. Abortion is not an abomination, but originalism, it may be. History is replete with unfairness, oppression, inequity. If Dr. King was right and the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, justice is more likely to be found in the future than it is in the past. The gift of Torah, the gift of our tradition, is that to honor the past is not to worship the past. To celebrate ancient wisdom is not to claim wisdom is better found in a crueler epoch. To believe in God is to accept that we human beings are created in the divine image, that our bodies are sacred and ought to be respected. And if your belief about God and what God wants differs from that, that is okay. Because long before we were quibbling over the nature of the 14th Amendment, guess what? America had already ratified the first. Shabbat Shalom. Friends, as we transition now to our Musaf service, I want to mention that I'm very proud of Beth Am's history of fighting injustice. And one way that you can join me and Rav Tyler in doing so is by joining us on May 17th, next week, not this coming, at 9 o'clock in the morning in Washington, D.C. There, the National Council on Jewish Women that I mentioned before is organizing a Jewish rally for abortion justice. Rav Tyler and I are leading a Beth Am delegation. I hope that you'll come. We'll be sending out more details this week. In the meantime, you can go ahead and register through the NCJW, but in addition to doing that, if you would please send my assistant, Devorah Cohen, an email letting us know that you're coming. We will figure out how to coordinate meeting up together in Washington so that we can join the rally together as a Beth Am community. Hopefully I will see many of you there. We'll lift up our voices and use our bodies, hopefully to bring about a little more good in this world. At this time, we can look to